Hello and welcome to another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson. I'm at the studio in downtown Hudson in the room all by myself, so I have my mask nearby, but works best for sound if I don't have my mask on. And my guest today is a candidate for Congress, Tricia Zunker. Welcome back to the show.
Hi, Jamie. It's great to be here.
All right, so you get to have the honor of the very first interview since the primaries for the fall November election, and we have a parade of candidates coming through at different levels. You happen to be the candidate for Congress for the 7th Congressional District that includes St. Croix County. Is that right?
That's true, and I appreciate being first in something. With a last name like mine, trust me, I'm used to being last.
I bet. Now, just refreshing everyone again for our congressional district, because I remember when we were in the 3rd and Ron Kind was our congressman, and that changed with, I think, the last census, and there was a deal cut to give St. Croix County to the 7th, which made it much more Republican and gave some very Democratic counties to the 3rd Congressional District. So thus we now have a district that has St. Croix County. And how about Menominee? That's in Ron Kind's, correct?
That is. And with that change in district, it did remove Eau Claire and Stevens Point, which definitely created, quite frankly, a gerrymandered district.
Yeah, and so the 3rd district has UW River Falls, UW Menominee Stout, UW Eau Claire, and UW Stevens Point. Mm-hmm. And 3 of those 4, anyway, used to be, I think, in the 7th. So that leaves, anyway, your district is pretty much the northern part of Wisconsin. If you drew a line from Green Bay over to Hudson and just cutting out Stevens Point and Eau Claire and Chippewa Falls, right? Yeah,
and in fact, if you look at a map of it, we kind of take a little bit of Juneau County, a little bit of parts of Toma are in there. It doesn't make sense when you look at the map that this is the congressional district because the way that it looks down there.
Yeah, so it's, again, that's a whole nother issue. It really is a state issue because the federal government doesn't have any control over how the congressional districts are drawn. But nonetheless, Wisconsin lost 1 congressperson from the previous census, and we'll see what happens with this one that was prematurely ended, I guess, by the federal government. So, yeah, a little bit's happened since you had a special election. You ran for the 7th, so you are now a veteran campaigner, is that right?
That's true. I was in a virtual event last night with the other Democratic candidates in Wisconsin that are running for Congress trying to flip districts, and Representative Gwen Moore was there as well. And I had the distinct honor of being able to talk about my experience already running for Congress this year. So it's true. We came up short in that special election, but we moved the needle over 6 points in unprecedented circumstances against 4 times the money. It's amazing that we moved the needle at all, quite frankly. We took a couple of days off.
By move the needle, could you just explain? I think you're referencing the 2016 election of Donald Trump, or are you referencing the 2018 election of Sean Duffy?
I think the numbers are pretty similar, but I'm pointing to the Trump numbers in 2016 and the voters here in Wisconsin 7. But as I was saying, we took a couple days off, but it was an unfinished job. And that following Monday, we were back at work, working to achieve our victory on November 3rd.
Now, why don't you just tell us again the qualifications that you had to run for Congress the first time, and it's not going to be much different now, but I'm just saying that you continued some of those experiences even though you it's a second race. Is that right?
Yeah. So by qualifications, are you asking just my background?
Yeah, prior experience, right, exactly.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Well, I grew up in a strong union household. My mom is a member of USW Local 2-224 here in Wausau, Wisconsin. I am a first-generation college graduate. I went to UW-Madison, where I earned a triple major and certificate in 4 years, and I worked 2 jobs because I had to be able to put myself through school along with financial aid and scholarships. And then I went on to law school. And after law school, I practiced law for a number of years, and then an opportunity arose in my tribe. I'm a member of Ho-Chunk Nation, and it was a special election, and it was for the seat of Associate Justice on the Ho-Chunk Supreme Court. I campaigned very hard. I prevailed in that election, and then I ran again for a second term. I am currently serving in my second term as Associate Justice on the Ho-Chunk Supreme Court, which I've been doing since 2013. I made my way back to central Wisconsin, where I was born and raised in Wausau. And shortly after returning to Wausau, I became involved with the community issues. I ended up being, the child poverty and food insecurity was a critical issue. It still remains an issue. I addressed it with the school board, and I thought, well, it's one thing to be somebody at public comment, which I really appreciate, but it's another thing to be a decision maker at the table. So I ran for school board, ran very hard again, unseated and incumbent, and a year later I was school board president. I continue to be school board president now in my second year as school board president, and have worked hard on issues not just with the within our district, but maybe last year you might recall the mascot resolution that was circulated throughout the state for WASB. Number of districts signed on. 3 school districts of the 31 that still retained a native mascot or nickname actually made the change. But that was something that I brought to my board, and got their unanimous support. And I said, hey, I'll seek co-sponsorship from districts around the state, and I did that. And that work continues. We're actually submitting it again to WASB. And it really just goes to the point that representation matters, because there were a lot of districts that were happy to sign on, and my board members were happy to unanimously support it, but it wasn't until an Indigenous woman was sitting in the seat to bring something forward that change started happening. And so yeah, those are some things that I have continued to do. I also teach virtually at 3 schools, 1 online law school and 2 online universities, and I am a solo parent to a 9-year-old son. And I continue to do all my jobs while campaigning full time, because as a solo parent, I don't have independent wealth. I have to just keep working. And so I might look a little more tired than the last time we spoke, but I'm doing it all every day.
So what's campaigning like compared to the first time around?
Well, we had to start campaigning virtually the last 9 weeks of the special election. So virtual campaigning hasn't changed much in that we continue to host roundtables, Facebook Live events, Zoom meetings, a lot of phone calls to voters, trying to connect with people and listen to their concerns. I guess the biggest thing that has changed is my opponent prevailed, and he's in Congress, so he continues to have bad vote after bad vote. That we highlight, because we're seeing that we don't have representation in Congress. But other than that, we are just continuing on. And, some of the roundtables that we have are related to current events that weren't as magnified during the special election. For instance, after the horrific murder of George Floyd, we convened a Black Lives Matter roundtable with Black leaders from throughout the district to just really have a conversation, but mostly to listen, see how we could be good allies. We had a Pride Month roundtable in June. We did a youth vote roundtable, trying to listen to our 18 to 20-year-olds and hear what they're concerned about. So different things continue to arise. We're trying to address different topics, and this pandemic just continues to languish on. We don't have enough PPE for our frontline workers. We don't have enough testing to really get this under control. We don't have the hazard pay and the paid sick leave that people deserve. The fact that the unemployment benefits haven't been extended is a concern. So there's been change, and there hasn't been change since campaigning in the special election.
Right. Well, I guess the primary was in February, and I think at that time unemployment was around 3.3%. Now it's over 10%, and I haven't seen specific statistics, but do you know how that's come down, what the impact on the 7th Congressional District has been?
Well, I don't have the exact numbers offhand either, but it's certainly increased. I mean, we talk to people that small business owners that are trying to keep their employees employed, to individuals that, maybe they were hairdressers, for instance, or other things where they had to shut down during the spring, and now they're back in being able to work, but with whatever the conditions might be. Yeah, I mean, it certainly has increased. We certainly see a difference in calls now than before that primary and the special.
You mentioned that your opponent beat you in the special election and has gone on to Congress and has had bad vote after bad vote. Without going through every vote, what would you say would be the top 2 or 3 that you most disagree with, and particularly as it relates to the 7th Congressional District?
Well, I think the very first act in Congress is something that I take great issue with. His very first act as congressman was to introduce legislation that would withhold federal funding from our schools if they don't physically reopen by September 8th. He introduced this bill with Representative Banks from Indiana, and no matter where you come down on the side of pandemic measures, holding our children and teachers hostage like that is just wrong. I'm school board president of one of the largest school districts here in Wisconsin. I know firsthand we need more federal investment in public education, not someone who threatens to take it away. We get about 10% of our funding from the federal government, and that is for services for students from low-income families, like free and reduced lunch, or services for children with disabilities. These are some of our most vulnerable students. So my opponent's very first act as congressman was targeting our most vulnerable students. I take great issue with that. But I also take issue with the fact that it was political grandstanding because it had no way of passing in the House with the Democrat-controlled House. So it was a waste of taxpayers' money, and instead of focusing on doing something to help our students and teachers during virtual learning, like expanding rural broadband access, which would actually be effective and actually be helpful, it was this act of political grandstanding. That's something I take great issue with. There's a number of different things, but whether it's his vote against the Moving Forward Act, which I would have voted in support of that. Most recently, the U.S. Postal Service, the House convened on a Saturday not too long ago to vote on funding for the U.S. Postal Service. He voted against that. This had bipartisan support. I guess that's one that I would highlight as well, because Wisconsin's 7th Congressional District is very rural, and many people rely on the Postal Service, whether it's senior citizens, veterans, disabled populations, or rural citizens, for medication in the mail, critical supplies, government benefit checks. We need to make sure that the U.S. Postal Service is fully funded so people can get the things that they need. So that's another one I take great issue with.
Okay. Well, there's been, speaking of funding, and you mentioned earlier the George Floyd, in the protest afterwards, there was a call to defund the police, and President Trump has tried to use that as his chief issue now, and your opponent has basically already identified that anything that President Trump is in favor of, he's in favor of. Where do you come in to play with regard to the funding of police? Do you want to see police defunded as well?
No, I don't support that. I think that's a very dangerous phrase. I think we need to evaluate how the funds are used by law enforcement, make sure that there's enough training, make sure that, when we look at things like annual training as a requirement, it's not enough. Looking at things like the requirements to serve on the various forces, but I don't support defunding the police. I back the blue, as they say. I support our law enforcement, but we must address the fact that there are people that have been murdered by law enforcement and not held accountable. So that is absolutely something that needs to be addressed, but we can do that without defunding law enforcement.
You think that's been a misunderstood issue, and possibly people are confusing? I mean, do you equate protesters with the looters and the rioters?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of confusion for people out there on that. It seems like people show up to create this illusion that people who are protesting Black Lives Matter are the looters. And, we've seen some stories where they're not. Even Kenosha recently, I can't remember the exact number, but after they figured out the number of people that were cited, it was a high number that weren't even Kenosha residents. We
had the incident with the gentleman, and I won't maybe loosely say gentleman because he was actually a juvenile, a 17-year-old from Illinois, came in with an AR, with an assault rifle and decided to kill people. There are people who are siding with him, holding him up to be a hero. Where do you feel about that?
Oh, no, what happened there was a crime. That was murder. We don't have to go into levels of first degree, second degree, murder, premeditated, whatever. But that was a horrific situation. I sit on the board of directors for the ACLU of Wisconsin, and I am a fierce advocate for people to be able to practice their First Amendment rights. And individuals that were there were protesting. It should be safe. It shouldn't be that there was a risk that somebody would go there because they were standing up for social justice and then end up murdered. And that's what happened. It's heartbreaking, but what happened was a crime. And it's also so tragic because the individual is so young that committed it.
Do you think that, you mentioned First Amendment rights. What about Second Amendment rights? Do you think that he was just simply exercising his Second Amendment rights to carry a gun as part of his protest?
Well, I support our Second Amendment rights, but as a 17-year-old, he didn't have a right to be carrying that weapon.
So you think that the laws that we have now regarding guns ought to be enforced then?
Do I think they're being enforced?
Yeah.
Well, that individual should not have been in possession of the weapon that he was. He was 17.
Okay. So I guess you identified some of the issues that you ran on the first time, and you mentioned how COVID already had come into play in the last 9 weeks of the last. Do you see between that and then the race protests and riots that have happened since, do you see a major shift in the substance of the issues being discussed in this race now, or do you just think it magnifies certain ones?
Well, that COVID-19 has certainly magnified some issues. I can think of three off the top of my head here. So, we're starting virtual learning in my school district, and that's how the school year is commencing. And it's been a very divided issue within the community. But for people that are insistent that we need to reopen the buildings so that students can physically attend together, I think there's a bit of a childcare concern there. How am I supposed to figure out childcare for my child who's going to be at home virtually while I need to go to work, and my child needs to do virtual learning at home? And that highlights the caretaker crisis. And this is something that I saw in the district before the pandemic hit. There are pockets throughout Wisconsin's 7th Congressional District where we don't have enough caretakers, and not just childcare, but also caretakers for disabled individuals and for elderly. And people are having to make difficult decisions. Do I quit my job because we don't have childcare, or do I drive 45 minutes one way because that's the only person I can find for childcare? So what it really comes down to is we need to make sure that we have a living wage for our caretakers, living wage and benefits, and then we can ensure that people stay in those positions because it'll be more reliable, right? They earn a living wage and have benefits. Why would they want to leave that? And also just the fact that people that take care of some of our most loved relatives, why wouldn't we want to value them for that critical work that they're doing? But that's been highlighted with COVID-19. Also highlighted is rural broadband access. And again, really with virtual learning, when we had to do that in the spring and districts had to kind of triage the situation because it came so suddenly. But even here in the Wausau School District, we had students and teachers that experienced internet issues. And this is something that exists throughout Wisconsin 7. We need to treat broadband like the utility that it is. We are depriving people of opportunity without it. And this is something that I would be highlighting right away in Congress, the fact that we need to make sure that everybody has that. It's inexcusable in this day and age that people don't have access to affordable, high-quality broadband. In fact, one of the resolutions that I brought to my school board recently that we passed and we submitted to our state representatives and we're submitting to WASB is about broadband access, urging legislation for affordable, high-quality broadband in Wisconsin. And then the third thing that has been highlighted with COVID-19, of course, comes to healthcare. You know, the fact that somebody could recover with COVID-19, they'll be deemed to have a pre-existing condition, potentially through no fault of their own. You know, if somebody's practicing safe social distancing and wearing a mask and all of the things that the CDC tells us to do, and they still get COVID-19, they'll have a pre-existing condition. My opponent doesn't believe that people with pre-existing conditions should stay protected. I do. I believe that we need to make sure that people are taken care of during this pandemic. Nobody should lose their home. Nobody should go bankrupt because of this pandemic. And just, it has magnified things, certainly.
Okay. So you were able to touch on childcare, broadband, healthcare. What other issues do you see that draw a distinction between you and your opponent?
Well, many. I mean, where do we start? The environment, my fierce defense of the environment. You know, when he was a state senator, he authored bills, or he authored the bills, or maybe the mining companies that benefited from it authored the bills, but he authored bills that made it easier for mining companies to come in and destroy our beautiful lands. We could talk about so many things. Public education. Like I said earlier, I believe we need more federal investment in our future, which is our children, which is investment in public education. That also includes in the adults that work in those buildings. Campaign finance reform. All of these other issues that we talk about, really, when you get to the heart of it, it comes down to campaign finance reform. Because these various issues that we face in society are solvable. But until we get the corporate money out of our elections, it's going to be hard. You know, we could talk about things like prescription drug costs. There's no reason that big pharma should get away with overcharging us here in America. They charge up to.
Well, you mentioned the pharmaceuticals. I thought President Trump has issued an executive order and made that whole issue just go away about expensive. You know, the whole thing about Medicare and coverage of the drugs.
Well, you know, there is a bill that's been sitting on Mitch McConnell's legislative graveyard since I don't know how long now, as it relates to prescription drug costs. But my point on that was campaign finance reform, right? Whether we're talking about big pharma, big ag, you're over there in St. Croix County. I know that there's that proposed 25,000 CAFO nearby in Polk County. Big ag, big oil, all of these entities that are putting money in elections. And we need to get that money out of our elections. We need representatives that are accountable to the people and only the people. And I think another distinction, and I should point out, that's why I refuse to accept corporate PAC money, because I believe we need campaign finance reform. Another issue would be immigration. You know, I think that this border wall is a waste of money. It is first century technology. We need to have 21st century technology to address the issue at the border. But, you know, I support our dreamers, these individuals that came here as children through no fault of their own and, you know, went to school here and productive members in our society and pay taxes. I believe we should have a pathway to citizenship for them. Criminal justice reform. You know, I think we come out very differently there. I think we need to end private prisons. I think that our prisons are overcrowded. It's really a drain on, you know, the budget. And I think that we need to decriminalize marijuana because we just have this hodgepodge approach. Recreational marijuana, that is, definitely as it relates to medical marijuana. I mean, if somebody's suffering, we should do whatever.
So you would be in favor of, there's a distinction between decriminalizing and then legalizing. Correct?
Well, I think we should legalize it. I mean, we can have tax revenue. We can get nonviolent drug offenders out of prisons and reduce the prison population. And I think we need to give people opportunity, not a record for nonviolent drug offense.
You would push to do that on a federal level rather than leaving it up to individual states?
I think the hodgepodge approach of different states, it creates confusion. And I also think that we have an ability to raise funds from the taxation.
Speaking of that ability to raise funds from taxation and an important federal program that is not left up to the states, and that is Social Security, what do you think of President Trump's executive order to basically defund Social Security and allow, rather than saying it doesn't need to be collected at all, but rather just deferring it so that all the tax will be due in January, but the effect will be no revenue coming in for the interim months?
I disagree with it. I think that it's going to cause problems in the new year to figure out where those funds are going to come from. And I also think that it's a roundabout effort to attack Social Security. And that is an earned benefit. People should be able to retire with dignity. I believe that we need to protect and expand Social Security, which is another contrast from my opponent, because he has made it very clear he is simply a rubber stamp for Trump. So he certainly will be supportive of any executive order that Trump issues, whereas I believe we need to ensure that people have the protection and security that they work so hard for.
The fact that the Republicans did not adopt any platform this time, first time ever at their convention, does that make it easier or harder to run against an opponent who is a Republican?
That's a good question. I don't know what the platform is, if it's just spreading misinformation and fear instead of actually getting to work and addressing the issues. You know, in the special election, I mentioned that my opponent had over 4 times the money than we did, and I think that we campaigned very well with what we raised. But he authorized an attack ad against me that the number was almost $250,000. It was an attack ad full of lies that ran over and over and over. And I just think, you know, if that's the platform, we're just going to attack with lies and fear. That's such a disservice to voters. We need people that are going to work hard to represent people, and that's what I'm all about. It means something to me to say, I promised I was going to do this for you, and to come back and say, I promised you, you believed in me, and here, I did it. I'm very goal-oriented, results-oriented, a hard worker. I'm going to work hard for everybody in Wisconsin's 7th Congressional District, whether they voted for me or not. So the fact of running against a non-platform, I'm focusing on how to help people here.
You mentioned your opponent's attack ad, and I was trying to remember it, but I think that at some point you were being lopped in as being embracing socialism. So is that your plan, is to get to Washington and introduce a socialist agenda?
No. I honestly, when I first saw it, I thought it's so over the top. Nobody's going to believe that, right? But it just, no. I just think that people are tired of attacks and division, especially in Wisconsin's 7th Congressional District. You know, I think people vote for the candidate more than the party. And that's how I am too. I really am just, how can I help? Whether a person identifies as Democrat, Republican, Independent, I want to be helpful. And I want to make sure that people have opportunities, because I come from humble beginnings, but there were opportunities that presented themselves in my life, and I seized on them, and I know what a difference it made in my life. And I think that's one of the roles of a representative, is to say, hey, this is going to help bring opportunity for you if you want to make a change in your life, or if you want, you know, whatever that might be. So, yeah.
Well, thank you. I think that that's a great place. We've reached our end of our time. And is there a way that folks can learn more about you? You know, we had 30 minutes here together, but is there a website or a Facebook page you could direct people?
Sure, absolutely. So the website is triciaforwisconsin.com. My first name is spelled Tricia for written out, FOR, Wisconsin written out in full.com. I do have a Facebook page, social media. We stay very active. You can just type my name, Tricia Zunker, in the box and in the search box, and it'll pull up the Facebook page. Also, Twitter is at Tricia4WI. Also stays very active. And I'm trying my best on Instagram. That's a tough one for me, but also it's Tricia4WI.
All right. Very good. Multiple ways to reach you. Thank you for your time. Good luck with the race in all the ways and forms that will show. And I guess the voters go on November 3rd, or hopefully before if they're voting by absentee.
Absolutely. Absolutely. People can go and request their absentee ballots now. All right. Well, thank you so much. It's been it's been a pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you. Tricia Zunker, running for Congress in the 7th Congressional District. I want to thank our viewers for Western Wisconsin Journal for watching. Keep watching.